there's reference there in a judgment oracle against Babylon to the beginning of birth pains. Okay? Not about an event in the end, but about the end for Babylon. Okay? Their end, the beginning of birth pains for that period of judgment on that nation. Okay? Just kind of keep that in mind. Then Jesus talks about a time of proclamation and persecution. You must be on your guard. You'll be handed over to the local councils, flogged in the synagogues on account of me. You'll stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you're arrested and brought to trial, don't worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. And to this point in time, all of these things took place in the period of the apostles and in the book of Acts, right? If you've read the book of Acts, you know these sorts of stories. They were indeed hauled before synagogues and before governors and other authorities, and they did speak by the power of the Holy Spirit, so much so that people looked at them and said, who are these men? They're from Galilee. Where'd they get this learning? We know that there were earthquakes and famines and wars before the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D., There were wars with Parthia in the north and the Nabateans in the south. There were the Gothic invasions over Rome. There were serious famines across the empire. All of these things have taken place. He's still talking about this period of time. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but those of you who stand firm, and here he uses it again, to the end, will be saved. Right? So we can think, oh, has he slipped? Has he started talking about the end yet? No, he's still talking about the destruction of the temple at this point in time. Then he finally, in verse 14, tells them about the sign. The sign. And you have to say it's a little bit enigmatic. He answers their question with a riddle, which is very typical of Jesus, isn't it, incidentally? He says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand, then it is time to run away. Now, you'd have to say that saying that the sign is when you see the abomination that causes desolation is a little bit vague on details, isn't it? But it's a phrase, again, a stock expression taken from the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, again in Daniel 11:31 and 12:11, makes reference to the abomination that causes desolation. And many scholars, and I agree with them, see this as reference to an event that happened after Daniel but before Jesus. In the 2nd century BC, when a fellow named Antiochus, a Greek Syrian king from Damascus, outlawed and abolished Judaism. He made it illegal to be Jewish. He put up an altar to a foreign god in the temple, offered pigs and unclean animals on it to defile the temple, destroyed copies of the Torah, and did not allow Jews to practice Judaism. Okay? Something similar, Jesus says, will be taking place, and you'll know it when you see it. So the sign, when it actually arrives, is not going to be vague. It's not going to be hard to pick. When you see it, you'll know it, because it is an abomination. It causes desolation and defilement. You'll see it, and it's time to run away. Now, if you're still wondering if we're going to get to a point, we will. This is still about who Jesus is, believe it or not. Okay? But he's talking still about the destruction of the temple in the context of judgment. In the context of judgment. Now, follow along here. In verse 15, let no one go on the housetop or go down and enter the house to take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those days will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Now that sounds like the end again, doesn't it? But keep in mind that this is another stock expression. If you were to go back to the book of Exodus in the context of the plagues against Egypt. Now, interesting again, it's another concept of judgment against a nation, okay? Twice in those plagues we're told that they were unequaled. There were more locusts in Egypt then than any other point ever. Now, we could take that literally and just say that that was just, because the Bible said it, the biggest plague ever. But I think in the context of both judgment and the rest of the prophetic literature, that this language of unequal distress is again a stock expression detailing the severity of the judgment that will bring about the downfall of the nation in question. Are you with me? So in other words, I'd be quite happy to suggest, or if someone suggested to me, that there had in fact been a larger locust plague someplace outside of Egypt. I'd be okay with that. Because I don't think that the description of being the largest or unequaled has to do with size. It has to do with significance. Are you with me? Now notice all the language of judgment that Jesus is using. And are you finding it strange that he's using it about the temple? You should be. The temple is the place where humanity meets God. And Jesus is saying it is going to fall under judgment. And this all basically comes to a head beginning in verse 24. I'll skip over those next few verses. Again, full of stock expressions, more concepts of false signs and whatnot. In verse 24, however, listen to this language. But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now, once again, what do we immediately think of? I mean, when those things happen, it sounds like the end, right? Call me a scientist, but that sounds devastating, doesn't it? But once again, we are using its language taken from the prophetic literature. If you have your Bibles with you, there should be some sort of a textual note telling you that those two passages actually come from Isaiah. Have a look in Isaiah chapter 13, which is where the first of those comes from, as I want to point out what's taking place here, because it's really significant for understanding what Jesus is saying in Mark chapter 13. In Isaiah 13, it should be headed something like a prophecy or a lament or an oracle against Babylon. This is about the destruction of Babylon, right? That power that had stood against the people of God had been raised up by God, but was now going to be judged by God and torn down, here's the important part, within history, never to be significant again. Right? That's what happened to Babylon, isn't it? Very important, torn down, never important again. Have a look in verse 10. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. This is an oracle against Babylon. It will be as if all of the constellations have fallen. All the stars have fallen. The sun will be darkened for Babylon. You with me? Chapter 34 then of Isaiah, verse 4, has a similar statement against the nations. All the stars in the sky will be dissolved, the heavens rolled up like a scroll, all the starry host will fall, like withered leaves from the vine, like shriveled figs from the fig tree. In Joel chapter 2 and in Ezekiel chapter 32, there are also similar kind of these apocalyptic visions of the destruction of a nation within history that ceases to be significant. Are you making the connection with Mark 13 yet? What is Jesus saying about the destruction of the temple? By applying this prophetic language to it, he is saying this, that the temple in Jerusalem will be destroyed and it will cease to be significant. You might as well knock it down, he says, because it will be eclipsed. It will no longer be necessary. It will become redundant. Do you see why they tried to pin that on him? Do you see why? That was one of the things that Mark refers to in the trial of Jesus. One of the things that they mock him about on the cross. This is a tremendous claim, saying in essence that the temple, this institution, this building, and all that it represented has somehow been eclipsed in history because it has fallen under the judgment of God. And then Jesus says something even more remarkable. Verse 26. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Again, it sounds like he's talking about the end, but he is not. Daniel chapter 7, we have this reference to the Son of Man coming on the clouds with great power and glory and receiving there from the Ancient of Days all authority and power and dominion and honor and glory. When does Jesus receive all power and glory and authority and might? At his death and resurrection, doesn't he? That somehow in that complex of events, in his dying and his being raised to life, we believe that he has been glorified by the Father, that all authority has been given to him, so that when he stands before his disciples in Matthew 28, it says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, he means that. Do you see what Jesus is saying here? The temple will be destroyed and eclipsed by me. I will replace the temple. I will become the place where God meets humanity. No longer will there be any necessity for sacrifices, because my sacrifice is complete. No longer will there be needs for rules and regulations, because it's no longer an institution, it is a relationship. I have replaced the temple. It has come under judgment because it has borne no fruit. It will be destroyed as it ought to be, but it will no longer be rebuilt. And if it ever is rebuilt, it's pointless. It will not function the way it used to function because I have replaced it. Now, it doesn't sound arrogant on Jesus' lips, does it? But he has just basically said, it is all about me. Hasn't he? Which, if you read through the Gospel, is what he does with everything. Doesn't he? You know the law? It's about me. The prophets? Me. You know about Moses? Pointed to me. David? Pointed to me. The temple? Me. Right? Anyone else, you'd kind of go, oh, you need to get over yourself. But for Jesus, as he's been presented for us, we kind of go, yes, this fits. And then